we are a few minutes past 1, so I say we should kick this event off. Thank you all for joining us for our Early Career Scholar ASOR Spring Brown Bag event. I am really happy to welcome Dr. Eric Kansa joining us today, who is the Program Director for Open Context and a champion of the data sphere, working tirelessly with the organization and the Alexandria Archive to responsibly and effectively publish open access digital content and creating opportunities for wider accessibility and engagement. Eric has dedicated his research and professional efforts to data informatics, research data policy, ethics, and professional context of the digital humanities. And we are very grateful for his time today and his help in improving our literacy on data management in this data-heavy world of archaeology. So I will turn it over to Eric and say thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Vanessa. And the gratitude is mutual and similar, so thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to get to meet and speak with you all, and hopefully we get to do lots of follow-ups and meet up in person too sometime in the future. So I'm going to do my screen sharing thing right now, and you'd think I'd be practiced at this after the pandemic, but I always fiddle a little bit, so let me do that, and then go to slide. Oop. Where's my view slideshow? Okay, yay. Hopefully you can see that okay. Yes, okay, good. All right, so I have a little bit of an echo, so maybe I should mute this. I'll turn down my volume. Can everybody hear me okay without echo? Okay, good. I am going to be talking about data management, and it is a topic that comes up a lot, and it's often something that is not really well covered in professional preparation in archaeology and related fields so much, and hopefully when going through some of the issues today, we'll see that it is actually really important, and it's not something that is just a little hoop that we should think about for getting a grant, like writing a data management plan, getting a grant, but really thinking about this as really core of the intellectual work that is involved in doing scholarship in the 21st century. And it's also something that if you engage with it in a deep kind of a way, it really opens up a lot of opportunities inside the world of academia, so career opportunities, but also outside too. And it provides a sort of maybe a bit more resiliency, more opportunities for people who engage in this than you may otherwise think you have. So there's lots of reasons why data management is important. So both for your own conduct as a professional, ethical conduct as a professional, and also for making sure that you feel like you have the opportunities and freedom of movement that you'd want to have as you advance in your career. So that's what I hope to try to cover today. So I live and work in Berkeley, California, and that's the ancestral territories of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people. And many of you will be familiar with land acknowledgements. And what I want to highlight about this is not just to sort of give you a bit of context of where I live and work, but also that the issues that are sort of encapsulated in some ways when we talk about do land acknowledgements, these kinds of issues are also absolutely integral when we think about how to manage digital data, especially digital data in the world of cultural heritage. So the issues that are present, the legacies of colonialism, the current systems of justice, systemic violence, all of these sorts of things, and the opportunity to try to do better, that is something that we need to really make sure that is part of our agenda when we talk about research data management, research data ethics. So we're going to return to this theme over and over again when I continue through this talk. So A little bit more background. As Vanessa introduced me, I work with Open Context, and Open Context is an open access data publishing service for archaeology and related fields. And the openness of Open Context is partially because that we believe ethically that some data should be open, and I say some, not all, absolutely not all. There's a lot of information that absolutely should not be open, but some resources should be open, and engaging with the ideas about what should be open, what is sensitive, what are the governance of this information in cultural heritage. Engaging with these topics are really interesting and important kinds of work, and navigating these kinds of issues really requires very thoughtful engagement, and considering how data is really part of a wider sort of sense of professional and social responsibilities that we have as researchers in the cultural heritage fields. So that's just to sort of highlight some of the sort of context and background of where we're working. Just as a little bit more background about Open Context, it is open. It is in the sort of world of open data. It's run on open source software. It's open access. It has open licensing permissions to allow you to reuse it. We work with the California Digital Library and other digital repositories for long-term preservation. And we've received recognition from professional societies, and including the digital library world, archaeology, and also from the Obama administration for trying to promote greater openness in the sciences. And again, just to sort of give you a little bit of a roadmap of what we'll be talking about today is, I've already mentioned that this really requires intellectual engagement, absolutely integral to all aspects of archaeological method and theory. Thinking about data as also integral with scholarly communication. So we're all familiar with this sort of notion of publish or perish. Data and how data fits into that world is also something that we need to be more aware of and more thoughtful about this, and how we go about trying to communicate our results, our insights, our own research with our peers. So thinking about data as an integral aspect of this, not a side thing, but it's something that is part of your other publishing goals. That's something that we need to also look at. And again, thinking about this in terms of like, yes, there's lots of transferable knowledge and expertise that one gets when one engages with archaeological data that is really valuable very broadly in different sectors of society. And that's something that also needs to be thought of. So you may have seen stuff like this. This is sort of like a kind of a simplification of the real messy reality of data in research. And this is a sort of conceptualization of it as a data lifecycle. You can chunk up these little wedges in different pieces as you like. There's also sort of aspects of planning that need to be thought of that might happen even before the creation phase. But essentially, data are integral to the research lifecycle, and the data lifecycle are sort of overlapping, where you're sort of planning and conceptualizing what your research program is going to be about. And as you're doing that, you're also sort of thinking about, what data do I need to collect? How is that going to be organized? How am I going to process it? Who's going to have access? What dependencies are there with other people that I'm working with? These kinds of things. And then how am I going to analyze that? How am I going to convince myself of the analytic results that they're actually useful and viable, and that they can be trusted? How do I convince other people that my analyses are trustworthy? And then how do I share all of the, not just the data, but the analytical steps that I use to filter and sort and aggregate and analyze those data? How do I share that with a wider community? And then how do I make sure that this is available for reuse by other people in the community? So there are lots of aspects of this that one needs to think about, not just as sort of at the end of your research, when you're like, okay, I've collected all this stuff, I've written my publications, I've written my dissertation, now I'm going to put my data into a repository. what you need to think about is you need to start thinking about how data fits into all of this from the very beginning, even when you're planning your own research. So the earlier you think about data management and the sort of long term of your data, the better off you will be in making sure that that data actually aligns to wider community needs. So that's the core message is the earlier you can think about this for planning, the better. There are two main frameworks right now that people have defined, so experts in the world of data management, for good practice in managing data. And one is the FAIR data principles, and FAIR is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And that's really kind of technocratic in some ways. It's basically about ensuring that data can freely flow between systems and between data sources. And the idea is to try to make data as fungible and fluid as possible to enable reuse and to make that reuse as convenient as you possibly can. So the idea is that the data that you would create from your own project needs to be able to flow freely into the data for future projects so that it can serve new research purposes, new educational purposes, new public outreach purposes, all sorts of new good things. So that's kind of a very, that's one vision in some ways of what good data management is all about. In addition to that, we also have the CARE principles, and the CARE principles are really much more focused on communities and the fact that data and information is socially embedded, and because it is socially embedded, the social context of information could be quite complicated, especially in contexts where there's been a history of colonialism. Then information that is collected may have really complex impacts on communities, and sometimes the free flow of information is absolutely something that would not be appropriate. And CARE principles is really there to sort of make sure that aspects of data sovereignty are recognized, so that you recognize that the information that you're collecting has impacts on communities. Those communities absolutely must have a voice in what data are being captured, how those data are represented and organized and described, and who has access to it, and what the benefits are of sharing or not sharing that information. So really, it's about embedding your own data creation and data management practices in the needs of communities that are stakeholders in the work that you do. So this is often articulated, especially for Indigenous data sovereignty, when you're working in contexts that are, say, important for Indigenous peoples, their ancestral territories, their landscapes, their cultural traditions and histories. Absolutely, CARE data principles are sort of like a foundational ethical framework for engaging in this. For a lot of ASOR communities, I think that one also needs to think about this as sort of CARE plus, in the sense that a lot of work in the ASOR community is, say, in places like the Mediterranean, North Africa, Southwest Asia, and there are important kinds of other considerations here too, where there are diaspora communities. There are people who are displaced by war, by climate change, and they may not be necessarily directly living in the landscapes that you're documenting anymore, but they're populations that might be living around you who are displaced peoples that have some sort of ancestral ties, have histories that tie back into the regions that you're studying. And that they need to be, you need to consider their interests and needs also when managing data. And so you can think of the CARE principles as, yes, it's originally formulated for the needs of Indigenous peoples and recognitions of data sovereignty, but really what it gets to is the fact that we are working in a very complex reality with lots of communities that have an ethical interest and have an interest in the data that we might want to explore with cultural heritage, and that we really need to be more thoughtful about engaging with those communities and thinking about what that engagement means in terms of how we organize and manage data. So think about this as sort of care plus, and it's the care principles needs to be extended in a lot of ways to lots of different kinds of communities, even if you don't work necessarily, say, in North America or other places that have a direct colonial history and in the same way that they were originally framed for the care principles. So happy to talk about that more, but it's a really interesting kind of a conversation. Okay. So you're probably familiar with grant data management plans, and data management plans are that's like a 2-page section of a National Science Foundation grant, and other granting foundations, granting sources. The White-Levy program for archaeological publications has a requirement for one. The National Endowments for the Humanities, and a lot of European granting sources also require some sort of data management plan, and these are often abbreviated as DMPs. And there are some key aspects that one needs to consider to include into a DMP. Just to highlight some of this is that think about that data lifecycle. And a good data management plan is going to be thinking about the data lifecycle and then articulating how these different phases of the data lifecycle articulate with one another. And that's one thing to consider. Another thing to consider is really context. Information is rarely created in isolation, and how are you going to relate the information that you yourself are creating with data that might be relevant, that is curated by other people, either within your team or more broadly across the community. And then the community interests and needs. This is something, it's not just about scholarly reuse, how is this going to be communicated to the rest of the scholarly community, but again, what are the sort of wider community and social issues associated with the data that you need to consider, and how are you going to be managing that? How are you going to actually capture, how do you know what information may be sensitive to a given community? How do you know if there are security issues associated with certain data? How are you going to go about trying to ascertain all of that so that you can manage your data in an ethically responsible kind of a way? So these kinds of issues should also be in a data management plan. And then there's the issues of sustainability, like how is this done, not just in the context of the sort of short term of your funding period, when if you get the grant, it could be running for a couple of years. What's going to happen after that funding runs out? How is the data going to be managed on a sustainable basis in the long term? And that typically requires some sort of engagement with outside infrastructure and services. So especially digital repositories, libraries, archives, that kind of thing. So that's an important aspect to consider also in a data management plan. And again, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, the FAIR and the CARE principles are really good to reference and cite in data management plans because they're recognized good frameworks of good practice. And so the more that you could reference, like I will be fair in these kinds of ways, and I will do align my work with the CARE principles in these kinds of ways. If you're very explicit about that in the data management plan, then you help the reader of a data management plan understand that you've been thoughtful about these kinds of topics and issues, and that you're creating a data management plan that actually has some depth to it. And you're not just sort of jumping through a hoop or doing something perfunctory, like saying data will be available upon request, which is a terrible data management plan. It's something that you see a lot, but it's actually terrible. So let's go on to some of the other kinds of issues. Now, addressing these things in your data management plan is a good idea. So again, ethical issues, we've discussed this, especially with CARE principles. Semantic and technical are also things to consider. Semantic meaning is basically the meaning of the information that you are curating. And in archaeology, this is actually quite hard because we have very little consensus in archaeology. And famously, archaeology has very few information standards. And we work in very different kinds of time periods. We look at different aspects of material culture, sometimes environmental data. There's all sorts of actually multidisciplinary inputs into archaeology, which makes the semantic agreement about what is it that you're collecting, how is it that it is described, and how is that description actually shared across wider communities. Because we have such little consensus, it's really hard to actually encode all of that in data sets in ways that promote, say, fair data practice. And that's a big challenge. I would say that semantics are also important for the care principles too, because if you want to express that certain elements of data are important for certain communities, that benefit sharing may be expected for certain communities, how do you actually express that in your data? That is a technical question that also needs to be answered, because if you want to actually make your care principles meaningful, it has to be integrated into the technology. It has to be integrated into the semantics of how you describe and organize your data. And that is another big challenge. Also, the technical side of things, like GIS is one type of data type, like geospatial data has its own special requirements. There are other kinds of requirements for doing things like linked data, where you make explicit relationships between the entities that you have in your own database and the entities that might be curated by other expert communities. So like outside gazetteers or control vocabularies or ontologies. So those things need to be expressed using the right technical formats and the right technologies. And that's another interesting kind of an issue. And we have to do this all on the cheap and with very little support, because that's just the nature of our world in archaeology. So there are all of these really interesting kinds of challenges. The more that you can sort of meaningfully address these things in a data management plan, the more powerful your data management plan is. And you can start to see that your data management plan actually needs to be referenced and part of your wider research proposals also. These are not something that is just something that you can really not necessarily capture all that easily in 2 pages. It is something that needs to be sort of integral in your overall research design. Okay, just to show some of the sort of complexity and all this, this is in some ways this as a reflection of like the semantics and how semantics are hard in archaeology. This is one database of Anglo-Saxon grave goods, and this is called an entity relation diagram. Basically, it shows the relationship between tables and relational database. And different databases, even on the same general topic of if you're studying Anglo-Saxon grave goods, even if you're studying that general topic, many different researchers will create very different looking entity relation diagrams because they organize their data in different ways. And data organization, the way that you model and structure the information that you collect, really are research method and theory choices. They're interpretive choices that reflect your priorities. And the way that you organize your information really enables certain kinds of interpretive pathways, and it makes other kinds of interpretive pathways harder to do depending on how you model the information. So this is another thing that is really needs to be appreciated, is that this kind of way of organizing information is, again, integral to every other aspect of your research. And again, it needs thoughtful engagement. So a few more things to think about for data management plans and data management in general. There's just a little bit of vocabulary here that's good to use and good to know. Identifier is something that is a really important topic, and I'll get into that in a moment, but it's basically how do you unambiguously name something so that you can reference it again and again, especially in different places. Identifiers allow you to relate information together from different places and keep track of things. So those are really important. Attributes, these are like descriptive properties that you assign associated with identifiers. So that's how you describe things. And oftentimes you'll describe things with control vocabularies. These are, in archaeology, there's traditions of typology, and typology is a type of control vocabulary. And that really gives you, again, those reflects interpretive choices about how you classify the materials that you encounter when you do your research. Metadata is also important. So that's data about data mostly, and there's different kinds of metadata, but really it's there to sort of help contextualize the information that you yourself are creating, and it helps to other people to sort of find it, helps other people to know what it's generally topically about. And the metadata standards and conventions that you may engage with will help make the information that you're creating more part of a wider context or wider reality, so that other people can actually know what your data set is all about. So that's an important kind of a thing. And then there are two different aspects of openness that are important. So open formats are important because software changes over time, and proprietary software especially, you do not want your data to be trapped in a format that requires a specific version of Excel to be able to open, like in 10 years in the future. If Excel changes or Microsoft decides that it doesn't want to support Excel anymore, is anybody going to be able to open up your data? So the best thing that you need to be able to do is to make sure that the data that you create, especially for the longer term, is available in open file formats, so that are accessible to a variety of different software and a variety of different operating systems. So those are really important kinds of issues. And then I'll explore a little bit more about what openness means also in a legal sense. So on that topic, in the legal sense, there are intellectual property issues that are also things to think about for data management. And IP issues are very broad, that covers a huge range of different kinds of areas of law. And for the most part, for the ASOR community, the kinds of things that are in the humanities and the social science, copyright is typically the most important kind of IP right, intellectual property legal issue to navigate. And the main thing to remember there is that it's granted for all expressive works by default. And it has really, really, really draconian enforcement, especially if, like, you're the Disney Corporation and somebody is using Mickey Mouse without permission from the Disney Corporation, then the fines are extreme. So 5 years in prison, $150,000 fines could be levied against somebody for violating copyright. And there are weirdness to this that is sort of weird for scholars. So like in the US, facts don't have copyright protection. So like if you write down that locus 3 of some site has 15 gray burnished wear shirts, that factual information is not protected by copyright. Somebody can lift that and just reuse it, and you don't have any copyright basis to say that, hey, that's my data. That's an interesting kind of a thing that is unexpected for a lot of people in say archaeology. But typically, when we are expressing information, sharing information, especially even with databases typically mix facts and expressions. So the way you organize the data, your control vocabularies, your notes, all the various ways that you sort of manage your own information is very kind of expressive. And so in the US, that sort of databases would often have this sort of mix of factual and expressive information associated with it. So and because copyright is so draconianly enforced, it's safe to assume most archaeological data is going to be copyright protected in the US. And in the EU, copyright protections for databases are even stronger. So what does all that mean? What it all means is that when you are thinking about sharing this information, archiving this information, making it available to the wider community, you have to think about copyright licenses. And the most popular licensing framework, the most widely used one, is Creative Commons. Most of you have probably seen Creative Commons copyright licenses, and they give you explicit permission to reuse copyrighted content. Typically, the main requirement is attribution. Sometimes there are stronger other kinds of restrictions associated with it, like you have to share alike, or you can only do this for a non-commercial purpose, or something like that. But Creative Commons licenses are basically required in order to make a data set that is actually reusable by anybody else. So you need to, like, if you want to make data that is reusable, it needs to have a Creative Commons license. You can't just sort of write in a comment somewhere, this data is, you could use this data for educational and non-commercial educational purposes, because like nobody knows what that would mean in real legal terms. But the Creative Commons licenses have actually explicit license agreements that are written by lawyers that are very explicit about what all of that would actually mean. That's why it's recommended as such good practice. So think Creative Commons if you're wanting to share data. Now, a couple of other things. As I mentioned, like facts and expressions are different with data, in the sense that facts aren't copyright protected, expressions are. Even so, this is where other aspects of intellectual property as it works in real practice matter. So social norms really matter a lot. Even if information is free of all copyright restrictions, let's say it's completely public domain, it is still your duty as a scholar to cite and attribute the source of the information, because you're providing provenance, and that provenance is an important aspect of scholarship. And so even if the information doesn't have formal legal protections, as scholars, to work in this ethically and as a matter of good practice, citation is an important thing to do. And referencing the sources of your information is important, even if it lacks formal legal protections. There are also all sorts of really interesting issues in terms of infrastructure. Technology really matters in how copyright actually works in practice. So you're probably familiar with, like, YouTube has like algorithmic copyright enforcement. So if you hum a tune and it's too close to like a sort of a pop song, then maybe YouTube will take down your video just because it sees it as copyright infringement. Plagiarism detection is an interesting sort of a case of that too. And then you have all those sort of like ChatGPT stuff and AI training and a lot of data sets that are gathered by big commercial entities to build their AIs. They're abstracting a lot of information, and they're pulling in information from major commercial repositories, and maybe who knows what big journal publishing is doing in terms of feeding these AIs. But in practice, it means they're sort of legally allowed to do that, because oftentimes you sign over IP rights to commercial aggregators, and then they can be pulled in. So why am I saying all of this? It's because technology matters, and that means your platforms matter. So choosing a venue about where you're sharing the information, and thinking about what is its governance, what is who has access to it, especially even for bulk things. Does it align with your values? So if you're thinking about data sharing strictly in terms of, I'm going to be putting up some materials as supplemental materials with my journal article, okay, well, if you're doing that with an Elsevier-owned journal, what is Elsevier going to do with that information? Is it going to be feeding an AI that you might not like? What is Academia EDU going to be doing with all of that kind of information? So these are things that you might want to think about too, because it's not just about what your own individual practice is, the metadata that you create, but choosing the platform for your dissemination, that really matters in terms of wider information ethics. So those are issues to also think about. I'm gonna skip a little bit of this. Basically, a lot of what I'm talking about too is really focused on this notion of structured data. Structured data is data that is according to some sort of formal organizational principles. So like data in a database, even data in a spreadsheet, like with rows and columns, that's structured data because it's organized in that sort of matrix of rows and columns. And the kinds of affordances that structured data give you, it allows you to quantify things. It allows you to do analysis, make graphs and charts and see regressions and really explore data in a quantitative way. Structured data is powerful in that way, but the way that you structured the data, it reflects a lot of interpretive decisions. And then how you share that structured data, again, has all of these other wider implications socially. So the platforms you choose, the communities that might be impacted, all of that kind of thing. So structured data is, you could think of it as sort of very dry and technical, but when you really unpack it, then it really relates to the sort of much more interesting, wider world of social realities that that you really need to be thoughtful about. I'm just looking at the time, so I'm going to fly through a little bit about this. So another aspect of data management is thinking about how do you promote good data quality. And good data quality is hard to define because oftentimes the formal definitions about data quality are really, is it suitable for some use? So data quality might be, you might create and collect data that's suitable for your own use, but as researchers, especially in archaeology, where sometimes we engage with destructive methods, or we're studying landscapes that may be threatened with climate change or development, and nobody is actually going to be able to go back and look at those places again because the data sources, the physical reality is going to be altered. Other kinds of processes. You have reuse could be very open-ended. You don't know what future research agendas are going to be. Those are really interesting kinds of questions. So some aspects to help promote good data quality are documentation, meaning that people can understand what your data are about. Specificity, the more specific the information that you make available, the better, because then people have a wider range of interpretive opportunities for them. So if you only share very aggregate data, then that's great for maybe one study, but nobody else can do anything else with it because they might without sharing the fuller picture of that information, then that piecemeal sharing of the information will not provide a very comprehensive picture, and you'll basically bias future interpretations in ways that are maybe unintended. So thinking about this, again, is really about thinking not just about yourself, but about wider communities. Essentially, that's if you want to encapsulate good data management, it's that really, not just think about yourself, think about wider communities and their needs. And I just am running very low on time, so I want to skip to ahead. You don't need to see a bunch of messy tags, but what I want to highlight here is that even one fundamental practice is just good identifiers, in the sense that if you're expressing information and you need to contextualize information that you are creating with information that other people are creating, really the key to that is through consistent use of shared identifiers. What that allows is the ability to join information, to relate information from multiple sources. And even if you don't work in a relational database yourself, you still have that responsibility, because the information that you create is not something that should be thought about strictly in isolation. So good identifiers allow you to do this sort of thing. So this is just a very simple example where because locus is expressed in a common way with common identifiers for locus numbers, then you can start seeing that you could bring together descriptions of those loci with descriptions of the bones and descriptions of, say, coins. This is just a very simple kind of an example, but it just illustrates that point that if those identifiers are broken for locus, then those relationships are obscure, and the bones and the coins and the context are only understood in isolation, and that breaks a sort of wider contextual understanding in archaeology. And because context is a fundamental interpretive tool in archaeology, identifiers are really important as a sort of key for this sort of meaningfully representing and using archaeological context. All right, I want to make sure that we have time for questions, but just really briefly, going from one project to a broader sense, identifiers are also really important for not just relating information within the context of one little project, but also thinking about how the information that you create on your own project relates to information curated by wider communities. These are just examples of identifiers from that little data set of bones and contexts and coins, where you can start seeing that there are actually communities out there that curate information about, say, biological taxa. There's something called GBIF, Global Biodiversity Information Framework. Uberon for describing animal bones. Because these, when you start referencing the identifiers for concepts curated by these wider communities, then you're associating the information that you're creating with information that is curated across the rest of the web, essentially, and that provides a much broader and richer contextual framing of your information. That describes a lot of really important meaning. So a good thing to reference in data management. I'm going to skip that. That basically is just an article that shows that this is actually really important for research. So this is a research outcome that because the data were aligned using all those common identifiers to share things like GBIF and Uberon and whatnot, it opens up new interpretive pathways for data reuse. And that's an important kind of agenda. Last thing, identifiers. Linking things in meaningful ways is also important for realizing things like the care principles, because then you can start referencing communities and associating certain parts of your data with communities, and maybe how that community has articulated specific kinds of interests in the data that you're creating. So this is another example of that. And there's lots more. And with that, since I'll try to do too much today, I guess, I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for some comments and questions. And I apologize if I threw a lot at you all at once, but main thing I wanted to highlight was that all of this is really an interesting, super fertile ground for engaging with archaeology in an intellectually really it opens up so many opportunities to think about how you do your research, how you conduct your research, how you communicate it, how your research fits within a wider world. And I think that thinking about data management is not something that's just a compliance exercise for a grant, but is something that you want to think about in terms of like, wow, this permeates everything that we do. That's why it's really interesting and really important. That if once you start making that connection, then your data is going to be so much more awesome, and you're going to be able to do work in this space that is going to be much more meaningful, much more interesting for yourself, and open up a lot more opportunities for both yourself and for the stakeholders that you need to address. So again, data are not just for management; they're for everything. So with that, I'll switch over to questions. And then, thank you. All right.
So the chat is open for any questions that anyone might have, or you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask a question to Eric directly.
Hi, hello, do you hear me?
Yes, hello.
Hello, very interesting presentation. Thank you so much. I would just ask a question, but it's more for the group, because I'm a data manager. I don't come from archaeology sector, so I'm really new. And it's really interesting compared to other sectors to see this, what you showed, the FAIR, F-A-I-R, was really interesting, really, really interesting. I just wondered what kind of, maybe we are too many, but I wanted to know who was the people here, what are their positions, if they are more working with data management or more as researchers, because I think it's interesting to know the public today also and to see what people are looking for. For me, I want to understand the data management in archaeology, basically. Thank you.
I think that's a great question. So feel free to jump in, everybody.
I can speak for sort of the ASOR that most people are coming from, the American School, right, of Oriental Research, which represents a huge gambit of research in the ancient world. So you have some people who are field archaeologists, some people who are working on texts and already published material, people who are working with really different types of data sets that relate to the ancient world. So I don't know if there's one way to categorize all the people in the room, but probably if we polled everyone, a really diverse approach to a lot of different questions and regions. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you know, just for myself, I mean, I started out in this world just from field archaeology, so and then that was my sort of pathway into it. And I think, you know, a lot of people, you know, we all manage it one way or another, data, even if we're not necessarily, if it's not a formal role in a project as the sort of project data manager.
So I have another question, sorry, as nobody's asking. So do you think it would be interesting also to include some, let's say, I don't know, I'm not really good in English, sorry, but like responsibilities with dealing with data in your own organization? Because as you said, as you mentioned perfectly, data are not for management, but so many people all the time, not only in archaeology, consider that data management is just for repository or for because management is asking for it. But I can observe that there is a lack of responsibilities in data management for each people in the team, you know? So I wanted to know, what do you think about this? Thank you.
That's a great question too. Does anybody want to jump in? I think just, you know, well, if somebody else wants to formulate some thoughts about that. I mean, I think one of the big issues, you know, conventionally in, you know, archaeology and ancient studies of the ancient world in general has been that the sort of singular goal typically has been sort of publication, but publication narrowly defined. So publication as of monographs and peer-reviewed journal articles and whatnot. And everything else has sort of falls by the wayside as sort of either kind of extraneous or is sort of incidental towards that ultimate goal. And what I see as a sort of a shift in the framing of what it is to be a scholar, especially a scholar in the 21st century, is that it's the world of there's this term reproducible research that you may have encountered. Reproducible research is something that's advocated by a lot of advocates for data sharing, basically. And the idea is that it's really important not just to sort of, you know, what you publish and where you publish it, but also how is it that your research is trustworthy? On how can you make sure that the interpretive claims that you're making have some basis and some sort of evidence? And data sharing is part of that in the sense that you're sharing the information that is informing your interpretation, but also reproducible research goes beyond that. It's not just sharing the data, but it's also sharing the analyses, the analytic steps that you use to filter, sort, crunch the numbers, basically, to come up with an interpretive claim. And the more that publication starts requiring things like reproducibility in how a claim is made, then we start seeing that publication is not just a sort of a singular thing, but you're sort of seeing that it's not just an excellence in the outcome of your research, but it's the excellence in the whole process of your research that matters. And in some ways, that also goes with the ethical issues associated with it too. If you're engaging in this work and you do it with like, you know, you're a jerk, you're doing it with like not engaging with local communities or stakeholders, and you're appropriating information that's important for them and they're misusing it, in the past, nobody would notice because the only thing people cared about is, that last publication. But the more that we start caring about the process of research, then the ethical concerns about how research is conducted and done and under what conditions are the data gathered, that becomes also more important too. So I would say the sort of it's a framing shift from not just outcomes, but to process and excellence in process. That's where a lot of this is, I think, is an important shift in the way we think about what good scholarship is in the 21st century.
So I have a question in the chat, and Virginia Withers is more than welcome to unmute and add to this, but she asks, I work as a photographer for an excavation, both site and artifact photography. How are photos managed as far as who has the rights to the photographs I take?
That's a really good question. And I would say it's ambiguous, and I'm not a lawyer and I'm not licensed to practice law anywhere. So if you want a definitive answer, you probably need to talk to a lawyer. But oftentimes there's a sort of a tacit understanding, like if you're a site photographer, then it's sort of like it's kind of a work for hire kind of a thing where at least the project itself would have rights to be able to use that photo documentation. Mm-hmm. Ideally, I would say attribution is really important. One of the interesting things about data sharing and data disclosing full data sets is that you can attribute absolutely everybody specifically. And that should be something that you model with your information, so that the people, all the different voices of people who are involved in the creation of archaeological data can and should be credited. And that's something that could be explicitly modeled with metadata for absolutely every record. And that's something that I think is a matter of good practice, because most projects are collective projects, right? So it's a matter of they're big collaborations, and the people's contributions in those collaborations need to be recognized.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, that's a key thing too when you think about like what good data management is. Like, how are you going to keep track of the contributors, and how do you credit those people? Also it's a matter of expectations too. If people know that the data that they're creating is going to be actually accessible, then that's maybe they'll create data and maybe with a different sort of professional voice in mind, and maybe a little less messy, or maybe maybe a little, don't put gossip into the data sets. There's all sorts of things to think about with that. But yeah, setting expectations ahead of time is really important.
So I'll ask a question while other people are still thinking of their last thoughts to ask you before we go. So you mentioned this idea of choosing sort of a sustainable data format, right, to host your data so that if the platform itself changes. And I'm wondering in terms of securing a good platform to build a database around, or a place for that, if you have suggestions on resources to consult, or like some things to look for, especially as like licensing schemes keep changing and become more expensive.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, your safest route is to use open source software, because then by definition, then you're not beholden to a license that's going to be pulled, where the rug's going to be pulled out from under you. That said, you should use the data creation, data management software that you're most comfortable with. Also, FileMaker is perfectly fine. Access is perfectly fine, especially when you're using it actively. ArcGIS, these are great tools, and yes, they're commercial. The main thing about them is don't only keep your data in their proprietary formats. Export out into non-proprietary formats. Most of these software applications, especially those big tools, allow you to do that. And so if you work with Excel, you could save your data as a comma separated values table. CSV, which is non-proprietary and can be opened up by lots of other things. And that's really the key. So it's to you can use the proprietary tools if you want, but make sure that you're also for the longer term, the data are going to be available in open formats that don't have that dependency on that one proprietary software. Now, as far as platforms go, over the long term, it's not, open file formats are great, but if it's still trapped in your hard drive and your hard drive crashes, an open file format's not going to save you. So keeping copies of your data in institutional repositories, places that have dedicated staff and have there's an institution that is dedicated to try to maintain this information, maintain it for future scholarship. That's another important aspect of it. And I really recommend nonprofit digital repositories, especially university libraries, for this sort of role. Don't rely necessarily on just archiving. It's not going to be archived. A spreadsheet with, say, a journal. If you publish an article and they said the article invites you to submit supplemental materials, it's a terrible long-term place for that information, because these journals don't know what to do with it. They're not going to maintain it in appropriate ways necessarily, and they don't have the business models or the missions aligned for ensuring that information is going to be available and accessible for the long term. They're not going to curate it appropriately. So you would want to work with a nonprofit institution that has the mission to do that and also the capacity to do that. So that's why university libraries and digital repositories that are trusted are the ways to go. Open context, we ourselves rely on the university libraries for exactly the same kind of thing. So we want to make sure that information that we publish is in other institutions, basically. So if our institution fails, it's available in other places.
Thank you. We're sort of running out of time, but if there's one last quick question that someone has to ask Eric before we close down the session. Okay, I'll take this silence as you've answered all the big questions about big data today. Thank you so much for joining us and for this really interesting presentation and approaching data from probably a very different angle than a lot of people have heard about before. I posted to the chat our Facebook link. We are the Early Career Scholars Committee. We host 2 virtual brown bags a year. We also host events at the annual meeting, constantly posting on that Facebook all different types of opportunities, whether they be scholarship calls, job calls, events, online events that are happening. So please join, participate, post your own events on there. It's an open wall for everyone so that we have great communication, share data, and strive to make this a more friendly data space circus. So anyways, thank you so much to Eric for all this information, for taking your time today, and thanks to everyone who joined the session.
No problem. And I really appreciate your time, and it was great to be able to talk with you all. And please, if you have any more questions or anything available for follow-up, happy to chat about this stuff.